South Africa is battling to save face with a string of negative stories making global headlines. Joining us now to discuss this is Jordan Griffiths. He's from Media Tenor. Jordan, thanks for your time. You've put together this report and it looks at how global media has covered headlines in South Africa. What have you found?
Thank you, Timmy, and thank you for having me. So this report is based on analysis from our international data, where essentially we have a number of researchers spread out across the world in the US, parts of Europe, Vietnam as well. We have researchers who code Chinese TV. And what they do is they look at primetime TV news in those countries, and they identify content that's about South Africa, and they code what that content has been about. So essentially they're looking at where has South Africa made news globally in global headlines. And essentially, we've done our analysis over 1 year, and we also looked at the last 20 days, from the 1st to the 20th of June, to get an idea of how we were covered there. So over the last year, we've seen that, for instance, last year, our coverage focused in May. We had the elections, which was obviously a big event. And then into September, we had the Oscar verdict. And much of South Africa's coverage globally last year came from the Oscar trial. Into 2015, unfortunately, the tone of our coverage has taken a significant dip. And this has been primarily driven by two key stories. The first is xenophobia, the xenophobic attacks which took place into April and ran a bit into May, which dropped sentiment on the country. And then most notably, the next one was the failure to arrest Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, the saga that's been playing out over the last 2 weeks. And that's also where a lot of our focus has been, in terms of we looked at the first 20 days of June to get an understanding of how was SA covered in those first 20 days. Bashir, he was #1, but we also saw that the FIFA saga was #2 in coverage. So at the moment, South Africa, in terms of the way it's been covered in global media, its coverage has been shaped this year so far by sort of those three stories: the xenophobic attacks, the FIFA scandal, and our failure to arrest Omar al-Bashir.
Yeah, I always find the whole sort of media angle also to markets, fascinating. I mean, we actually help to develop tools at the moment where you actually scan social media to pick up the stories, and actually it generates trading ideas on the back of the prevalence of certain words, etc. I mean, just maybe can you go through a little bit of the methodology of how you developed the report? What are you looking just at primetime news? I mean, what other channels? Is it just news feeds, news wires? Yeah, maybe give us a bit of color around that.
All right, sure, 100%. So for instance, in the US, we're looking at like Fox News, we're looking at NBC, and we look at specific primetime news channels on those particular networks. And then, the footage is generally 15 to 30 minutes in terms of their news. And our researchers will code the entire news clip. So they won't only focus on South Africa, they code news from across the world. And when, say, a newscaster or presenter like yourself is talking about South Africa, they'll identify, okay, who is the protagonist? The protagonist is South Africa. What topic are they talking about? FIFA. How has the presenter spoken about South Africa in relation to that topic? Has it been negative or positive? Has there been a particular person that's been mentioned? So that's one example. Then obviously in the UK, we're looking at like BBC Newsroom. We have a number of channels in Germany which we monitor. In Vietnam as well, we also monitor Chinese news. So it's just these sort of key snippets of the equivalent of our SABC, if that makes sense. So our SABC 1, 2, 3, or ETV, those prime times news segments, we're analyzing those abroad.
Jordan, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it at that for today, but we do hope to get you back here to see what your analysis of what the other trends have been. Thank you so much. That was Jordan Griffiths, and he's from Media Tenor, telling us about those trends and how South African news has been covered